Here's something interesting and also kind of sad. CNBC's Joe Kernan attacked me as a socialist on Twitter the other day. And this actually relates to a bigger picture thing that's going on. When I was 15 years old, I started paying attention to political news and business news and financial news. And I started investing a little bit of the money I earned at Circuit City, where I worked in high school. I started watching CNBC and CNN and reading newspapers and political magazines and reading old investing books by Ben Graham and by others and just learning about this stuff. And in doing that, I got to know a lot of who the news people were at the time. And sadly, now as an adult who's working in news media, I've gotten a chance to meet or interact directly with a lot of these people. And I am so disillusioned with a lot of them that I can't believe that I ever thought that they had great things to contribute when I was a kid. I mean, maybe they did at the time. So like one example is I never met her in person, but I used to respect Maria Bartiromo. Okay. When Maria Bartiromo was on CNBC, she was the first woman to report from the floor of the stock exchange. Very interesting. I saw her as a strong interviewer who would confront corporate CEOs with tough questions and deliver financial news in a business that was so dominated by men at the time. She now has a show at Fox Business Network, has completely jumped on board the Trump sycophant brown noser train, and she truly disgusts me. Like, it's just sad what has happened to Maria Bartiromo. Someone else that I used to admire, who I now know personally and am hugely disillusioned with, is Scott Adams, the creator of the Dilbert cartoon. When I was growing up, I loved the Dilbert comics. I read all of them. I read some of Scott Adams' books. I thought that the comics were hilarious in terms of being commentaries about corporate culture. I found the books interesting. I've now interviewed Scott Adams multiple times. Sometimes we direct message privately on Twitter. And as I've told him publicly, it's become a huge disappointment. I mean, a childhood disillusionment to see him become this staunch defender of Donald Trump. Really, really sad. And there's now another person we can add to this list, and his name is Joe Kernan from CNBC. Joe Kernan has been on CNBC, yes, since I was a 15-year-old and started watching business news. He's a guy in his early 60s who's been with CNBC since 1991. I don't want to pretend he was ever a hero of mine, but similarly to Maria Bartiromo, I grew up watching him interview corporate CEOs and the whole thing. And I already started to look at Joe Kernan very skeptically when he was on a panel interview with a former Facebook executive a year or two ago. And he was asking like the dumbest and most uninformed questions about social media and social networks. And I thought, man, Joe Kernan might have no clue what the hell he's talking about. And it is now much worse because over the weekend and late last week, he got into an argument about whether CNBC is now jumping on the climate science denying train because of an interview that he did related to climate science or something. I ended up getting tagged into this Twitter thread about it. And Joe Kernan tweeted something so ridiculous about carbon dioxide, which has become a popular talking point on the science denying right, that carbon dioxide is great because plants need it to breathe. We breathe out CO2 and plants breathe in CO2. So more CO2 is great for plants, which of course ignores all of the science around this. And it ignores the idea of an ecosystem in balance in the same way that, listen, humans need water in order to live, but at a certain point, too much water becomes bad for us, right? The same sort of logic applies to carbon dioxide. So then Joe Kernan shows up and tweets in this thread that I'm in, you do know humans exhale 100 times the concentration of atmospheric CO2. Ever had a Coke? Be careful, laced with poison, which is just so dumb. And I responded, damn, to think I used to watch Joe on CNBC when I was a kid growing up. Depressing. And sort of surprisingly, Joe Kernan responded to me and said, yet you still grew up to be a silly millennial socialist. That is depressing, which of course is number one, using a socialist as an insult. But more importantly, I am not a socialist, which I told him saying, hey, Joe, I'd love for you to present one shred of evidence that I'm a socialist. And of course, I never heard back. So when this stuff happens, yeah, like it's depressing on a personal level to see these people out themselves as toxic, fact-free, science-denying ideologues. And it's also just depressing that I used to actually look up to some of these people, not ideologically, but in terms of their kind of place and role in the media sphere in some very basic sense. And it turns out that they are truly horrible people contributing to the weaponization of ignorance that has become endlessly prevalent in the era of Trump. So I guess someone else on the list that now is going to be seen very differently by me and probably by much of my audience. Although my guess is my audience probably already had a far more negative view of Joe Kernan than I did before these tweets. Let me know what you think. Make sure you're following the show on Instagram at David Pakman Show and follow me on Instagram at david.pakman.